Why do you think you fell in love with the art of podcasting, the art of talking to other people, learning about them?
I think that at first, when I started, I didn't know what to expect. So I didn't go into it with that expectation. But the first time I interviewed somebody, it was somebody I knew, but I learned a bunch of new things about them and actually wanted to take notes myself. So I went back later and took notes because I'm like, wow, there's a lot here. Like we only talked for 20 minutes and it was huge, right? And that's what I loved. I was like, whether I knew somebody or not, if you do a good job asking the right questions, they might even learn something along the way as well. So I had started a second show. I called it Creating a Brand because while I was doing these side hustles, I was like, well, I want to learn from successful entrepreneurs how to leave a 9-to-5 job. So the idea was the art of creating a brand. Like, how do you actually leave this 9-to-5 job to become a full-time entrepreneur? So I was learning along the way. And what I found is I became very passionate about it. The first thing is that I learned, and I want to share this because I think it'd be very valuable for people listening. I learned what entrepreneurship is and how to make this happen in 4 steps. And I'm way oversimplifying it, but I think it's very valuable for people to hear. The 4 steps to leaving your full-time job to become an entrepreneur are as follows. Number 1.
What's your number 1 piece of advice for growing a successful podcast?
So first and foremost, treat it like a business. Even if it's a hobby, yes, let it be a hobby, but build some structure around it. You don't necessarily need goals to get it to grow big, but you need to make sure that that hobby doesn't become something that you hate or that you just don't want to open up and start doing because it's so much work. You want to build a system around it. But once you've really kind of figured that out, what really matters is who are you serving? Who are you podcasting for? The more connected you can get with who that person is and the problem that you're helping them solve, the better your show is going to end up getting. I've got a lot of friends with younger kids, and the kid that's the most wild, that seems to be the least focused and just not doing well and excelling in different areas of life is the one that typically reminds me most of me. And when I say that, they're like, really? Like, I just figured you were a straight A student, good at everything. I'm like, no, I'm actually still to this day pretty much terrible at everything, except for the few things I'm actually good at, and not putting myself down. But when I see the kid that's like that, even at 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, right? When I see that kid, I'm like, wow, that's the one that reminds me of how I was. My first struggle was letting go of perfection, letting go of my own pride in it, right? We're all work in progress. I mentioned pride being part of my life early on. So when we launched, it didn't look the way I wanted it to. We didn't have a logo. I had typos everywhere. But I went back to that 100 people that I got their contact information, the ones that said they wanted it, and I said, does it work? Hey, your logo is ugly. I said, not what I asked you. Does it work? Hey, you spelled this wrong. Not what I asked you. Does it work? And I kept on hearing the core function works, but I'm very confused on how to get there. And so what I learned is just let go of the complex stuff, let go of the perfection.
I just wrapped up my conversation with Alex Sanfilippo, and boy, did we have a lot to talk about. So Alex is actually the founder of PodMatch.com, which is a website that helps pair podcast hosts and podcast guests for interviews. And Alex has a really unique entrepreneurial story. So when he was a kid, he actually used to pull golf balls out of lakes and sell them to other golfers. Thankfully, he wasn't eaten by any Florida Gators out there. But as Alex got older, he actually became a real estate entrepreneur and was really killing it until the financial crisis, when unfortunately he lost it all, which he describes in our conversation as perhaps the lowest point in his life. But Alex pulled himself back together and went to go work in corporate America, and actually went to go work in an aerospace career. But later on, Alex's entrepreneurial spark reignited, and now he's on a mission to help indie podcasters have their voices heard. Overall, Alex's story is one of resilience and service to others. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Alex. Alex, welcome to the podcast, brother.
Daniel, I'm so excited to be here, man. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I mentioned to you earlier, I've been binging your show, so it's kind of cool to be in this seat now. So really thankful for what you do.
Yep, awesome. Candidly, it's been a long time coming. So to share a little bit for the audience, a lot of my guests and a lot of the sensational conversations and stories that I've been able to have been through PodMatch. So before I get into anything, Alex, I just wanted to say thank you for everything that you do for the podcasting community.
Yeah, man, it's absolutely an honor, and I love this community, this group of people. Like, I'm 100% in on podcasting, as you know, and it's just truly an honor, man. And to hear such an amazing show, like I was listening today to your episode with Terrence, it's episode 90 of your show. I am not a creative entrepreneur. I'm creative, but I'm not like a creative entrepreneur like him. And his story and journey was just like so cool to hear, man. So again, honored to even play a small part because I get to hear some of these things. So it's so happy to be part of it.
I appreciate it. Yeah, Terrence is him. He's a cool guy. It was really fortunate to talk to him, and always cool when you get to talk to an entrepreneur, especially, but a creative, because I think that's like such an interesting realm. But to get into your story, out of everything that you've accomplished and everything that you will continue to accomplish, here's where I want to start. So take me a little back to young Alex. Did young Alex always know he wanted to be an entrepreneur?
I wouldn't say that young Alex knew. I'm talking about myself in the third person here, but like as a young boy, I don't know if I knew initially that I wanted to be an entrepreneur, but I did have a very interesting realization at the age of 9, 10. And I guess this makes me very self-aware as a kid, but I realized I wasn't good at some of the things that other kids my age were good at. Many of my friends were really good in school, and I was really bad in school. Some of them were musicians, and even my brothers were musicians. I just didn't get that talent. And to make it even worse, like I wasn't good at those things, but I also wasn't good at sports or video games. So I just knew like, I wasn't beating myself up as a kid. I'm not trying to talk bad about myself. I just knew that like I was a step below everybody on all those things. And I never was like, oh man, I'm slow. And it didn't cause any complex for me or anything like that. But I just knew I hadn't found my thing. And again, for a 9, 10-year-old kid, that's pretty self-aware. But at 10 years old, I actually did discover something that I was good at. And it happened to be business, entrepreneurship, even. Because when we were kids, me and my brothers and the kids I was hanging out with in the neighborhood, there was a golf course across the street. And all the parents said, don't go to the golf course. And us as kids, we always ended up there. We just kind of like, I guess, gravitated to where our parents told us not to go, which is pretty usual for a kid, I suppose. But anyway, one day I was out there and I found a golf ball. And there was no golfers out there, but I was like holding it. And someone drives by on a cart, a golfer, and he goes, hey, kid, what does that golf ball say on it? I was like, Titleist Pro V1. And he goes, I'll give you $3 for it. So I gave him the ball. He gave me $3. And as a 10-year-old kid, that was a lot of money. And I was like, guys, I've got an idea. And at that point, I found finally, I guess you could say, right at 10 years old, the thing that actually I excelled at, which was organizing a team, telling people, hey, go find them, you clean them, we'll bin them, we'll set them up in bins, and Saturday morning, we're going to sell a bunch of these things. And we did that for a couple of years. You can get away with it when you're cute. After you're not cute anymore, you can't really get away with it. But for about 2 years, me and my brothers and friends, we would get together and a couple nights a week go find golf balls, and on Saturday morning sell them. And we were making a lot more money than kids selling lemonade in the neighborhood and stuff like that. And that was, again, my realization of like, wow, I think I'm built for this thing called business. And just a ton of side hustles throughout high school and stuff like that along the way. But that was like my first discovery with kind of figuring out what I'm actually good at.
Thinking back to, I don't know how many years ago this was. Not dating you, you look great by the way, but basically when you used to sell those golf balls, because I'm trying to think from the business aspect, what were the margins like back then, or was it kind of an infinite margin? Because like you just found a golf ball and like anyone would pay you $3 for it.
Yeah, I mean, there was. I was born in '88, so if anyone wants to do the math, I'll let them do that. And this was sometime in the '90s, and I wouldn't say there was any margins. And sorry, Uncle Sam, we weren't paying taxes on this. You know, we're 10-year-old kids. We'd find them in the different lakes because golfers in like neighborhood golf courses are awful, so they mostly go in the water. And so when we found them, we just kind of started realizing we at first I was like, every ball is $3, and people were like, no, I'll give you $3 for a Titleist Pro V1, but not your top flight. And so we ranged from 50 cents to $3 was kind of what we ended up doing. So we organized them in that way. But if you asked any of the guys, it was 100% profit because we didn't know the value of our time. Also, we weren't doing anything else anyway. So I don't know, 100% profit margin. Sure. Why not?
I love how you mentioned that. You almost had like a catalog of like golf balls. Like this is like the basic one. This is like the more expensive one. So I mean those are important skills to learn at a young age, because then you could tell the difference from like, an H&M shirt versus maybe a more designer shirt. Even though, this is an H&M shirt and I like slim fit, and regular stuff, but you kind of get the point what I'm talking from.
Yeah.
To get into one of the things that you were actually talking about earlier. So you mentioned how you noticed that other kids were good at some stuff and you weren't great at, similar stuff, or you had to take some time to seek what you were good at. And you found out that was entrepreneurship. And I think a really common dynamic we see is that a lot of really successful entrepreneurs ended up being terrible students when they were in school. A lot of them ended up dropping out. Not to say that there aren't some that were really smart, but maybe those are more the anomaly. A lot of people typically have trouble fitting into your typical mold. So for any parents out there who have kids who seem to be kind of a little more entrepreneurial and kind of less, I'll say, traditionally oriented towards like the traditional education and professional program, what advice would you have for them when it comes to raising entrepreneurial kids?
Yeah. This is a great question. And I love getting to answer. So thank you. It's a gift. Absolutely a gift. The thing that I'd share first is don't look at your kid negatively at all. I've got a lot of friends with younger kids, and the kid that's the most wild, that seems to be the least focused and just not doing well and excelling in different areas of life, is the one that typically reminds me most of me. And when I say that, they're like, really? Like, I just figured you were a straight A student, good at everything. I'm like, no, I'm actually still to this day pretty much terrible at everything except for the few things I'm actually good at, and not putting myself down. But when I see the kid that's like that, even at 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, right? When I see that kid, I'm like, wow, that's the one that reminds me of how I was. And a lot of parents immediately want to compare that kid to the rest of theirs and be like, oh man, this is the one that's going to cause all the trouble. And the reality is, maybe that's true to a certain extent, but they're also the ones that think very differently. If there's one thing I've learned about people that move the world, change an industry, make a big dent in something. It's the person who really is against the grain, right? They're a little bit different. And not to say they're always super edgy or doing wrong things and pushing limits, but their mind just works a little bit differently. And for myself, I'll be real. Like when it came to school, I really wanted to make my parents proud of what I did. I worked so hard in school. I never got better than C and D. I just struggled so much through it. But the funny thing is now that I'm like an entrepreneur and an adult, I'm still just as bad at learning things unless it's something that I can see a true benefit in me learning because it'll excel what I'm doing and actually ultimately serve other people. But like learning another language, it's out of the ballpark for me unless someone tells me, hey, it's time to move all of PodMatch into a Spanish market. And then I'd be like, cool, I'll learn it. I guarantee you I can learn it really fast. But without that piece, if there's not a real interest in it, I'm not great at it. So I do look at those kids once again, speaking to parents here, don't hold that against them. Instead, find ways to help them flourish in the thing that they actually are really good at. My dad was always really good at that. My dad was an entrepreneur as well. So he was good at pushing me to do things. He's like, hey, check out this eBay thing. You think you could sell stuff on here? And that was like one of my first side hustles after doing golf balls was flipping things on eBay, which for a young kid seemed weird, but I was really good at it. And I was making profit doing that. It wasn't 100%, but it was actual profit doing it. So yeah, I think this is, again, a really valuable question, something for us as parents and stuff like that to think about, okay, how can I help this unique child turn into the person they're going to be? And maybe it's an entrepreneur, maybe it's something different, but they're going to do something unique because they don't really fit the grain like the other kids around them.
Look, you're not alone in that, and if I must shamelessly admit, in my humble opinion, from growing up, going to a traditional public school, grades 1 through 12, I think fifth grade was definitely the toughest. I remember back then, my teachers were really hard on me for whatever reason, and I did not get good grades. But hopefully things have worked out and will continue to work out. So no shame in that. You're not alone, but I want to touch upon one of the things that you just spoke about because I think it was really powerful. Because you mentioned, learning Spanish unless you had to, and I think a lot of the times people are judged based off a lot of the results they are. And while results do matter, I think a lot of times people can only do great work if that part of great work is a step towards their ultimate mission, as opposed to, for example, like learning Spanish, as opposed to like learning Spanish, learning another language for the hell of it. So one thing that I would definitely emphasize is that when you're looking at an entrepreneur, when you're evaluating someone, or say if someone's working for you and they don't have the best performance, ask a really honest question of like, is this person aligned with the mission that I'm going for? Because honestly, people will put up with work that they don't like if they know for a fact it's a goal that they're striving for. So I would just emphasize that.
Yeah, that's good.
So thinking back to when you were young and you started this entrepreneurial thing and you were playing, the organizer here, what would you say the biggest entrepreneurial lesson was you learned at a young age?
How to talk to people. Yeah, I guess as a kid, even more scary, talk to adults. And the weird thing is, you'd think, like by hearing this, that people would be out there and be like, oh, cute kid, here, have extra money, right? Every weekend we were out there, someone would try to scam us. And a couple times people were really smart and they were like crafty. So they'd end up like taking money and we didn't realize they did it because they'd have us look away and they'd like pull money. I'm like, dang, this is like, aren't you all spending a lot of money to be out here on the golf course? And so I learned to get really savvy when it came to negotiating and watching out for people that had ill intent. And I carried that with me throughout business. And I'm not like a guy like always looking over my shoulder or anything like that, but I've developed a very good skill of being able to look at somebody, and perhaps this might go beyond just a learned thing. Like I do believe that some of us have things that we're born with. I have an odd ability to be able to look at someone within 5 minutes. I can tell you most of their past, and I can typically tell you the next 7 to 10 years of their life as well. And I'm not like a fortune teller or anything like that. And I don't know if that's a learned skill, but I've only met a few people able to do that. And a couple times it's been put to the test. Someone's like, oh yeah, tell me about myself. And I told them their entire background, like, you cheated, you look somewhere, how do you know all that, right? And so maybe that was a learned skill from that. But the reality is I'm very good at reading people and understanding what their actual objective is. Even if they don't really realize it yet, I can actually pull it out of them. And I tie a lot of that ability to communicate, to negotiate, to actually have conversation with people back to that young age. Because from then on, I had no problems talking to anybody. And not that I was like that annoying kid trying to talk to adults every chance he got, right? But like if I was engaged in a conversation, I can remember my mom was always talking to people and they're like, how does your 12-year-old son know how to like have a conversation like that? Like I felt like I was talking to an adult. And so I tie that back to that first experience as an entrepreneur.
So thinking back a little bit, you grew up in Florida, right?
Correct. Yep.
So a little off topic here, but just something that I remembered in the back of my head. Florida has a lot of gators. So were you guys ever scared of like a gator coming up and just like, messing around with you guys as you were going for those golf balls?
You know, I had a great mother. I still have a great mother. She was very naive. I mean, it was before the internet was really a thing, but like, yeah, every single pond we were digging in had gators swimming right around us. And worse than that are water moccasins that are everywhere. They're like actually aggressive. And we weren't even wearing snake boots. I mean, thank God, I will say this, thank God that none of us ever got bit, nothing bad ever happened, because we were in and out of those lakes all the time, those ponds. And we were never scared of them. So sometimes they'd come up to us. We always had like a stick, or we had BB guns too. And we just like hit them or shoot them, and they'd swim off. We'd kill the snakes as well. But I don't know if my mom or any other neighborhood moms knew we were packing with BB guns and machetes and stuff like that. But like, that was part of the job. But yeah, none of it, thankfully, I praise God, none of us ever got bit or anything like that. I'm super thankful for that. But we probably should, now I'd be more careful. Now, if you're like, hey, there's a golf ball on that lake, I'd say not a chance, right? Like, I'm not going near that.
That question just kind of came into the back of my head because I was listening to another podcast recently, and one guy grew up in Florida. He's like, yeah, like if you grew up in Florida, like you tell everyone, if there's a body of water, there's alligators in it. So in the back of my mind, I was like, wait, like golf balls, lakes, like aren't there dangerous animals swimming there? But thankfully, we were able to survive.
Yep. And you're exactly right. That is the reality. If there's a body of water, there's snakes and alligators in it here.
Yep, for sure. Well, kind of as you got older, and as you wanted to kind of go into more of a legitimate business, what was that first legit business that you had?
Yeah. So again, I did some side hustles through flipping on eBay or buying on eBay, then selling other places. Like I just love that stuff. But at the age of 15, I had the opportunity to work with a real estate company that they were the original tech creators of something called a virtual tour of a home, which is now very common. You go to a website like Zillow or anything like that. It's where you drag your mouse and you can look at the roof and flip it all around and kind of go through the house, right? We're talking early 2000s at this point, and we pioneered that tech, and now it's built on a totally different framework, so people are not still using the model that we had. But at that point was my first like tax paying legitimate business that I started. So I worked along a real estate company. We were posting directly to the MLS. I had 4 photographers and 3 editors working for me, building out these virtual tours and posting them for realtors' actual listings. So that was my first legitimate business. And the funny thing is, it was a completely remote business. I never even met some of the photographers. Hired them remotely. They worked. They knew what to do. Like I had somebody train them, all that stuff. And so it's kind of funny to think about it. And we used the tools that exist now didn't exist then. We were actually using sounds super like makes it sound really not legit, but we were using AIM, AIM. It
Back
was
in the
AOL
day.
Instant Messenger is what it was, and we were using that to communicate because you could set up a private chat. So we had our own private chat channel. So thanks Slack for upgrading us, but that's what we were using back then. So that was to me my first like legitimate business I'd say that I ran.
So speaking about that time, obviously you're working in real estate. What did you love about working in the real estate industry and working in that kind of vibe?
Everything was just different. I mean, every day I was psyched to be able to review this work because every house looked different. People do like these crazy upgrades, if you can even call them upgrades sometimes, right? Like, and so there's all these like weird things. And I just really enjoyed seeing the real estate. And it was all in Jacksonville, Florida, which is where I grew up and it's where I still live. I love the city. So I just got to know like the city remotely, interestingly enough. But like I really enjoyed that element of it. And then I really liked seeing a starting product, a photographer going out with all the elements involved in it, and a professional editor going through and being able to make that look really polished and clean and nice. Like the whole process was just, I think, so much fun. Really enjoyed it. And it really did cause me to fall in love with real estate. Like I absolutely fell in love with the whole industry at large.
Do you remember the biggest house that you got a chance to work on?
Yeah, we worked on. Yeah, who's the quarterback for Jacksonville Jaguars? I think Mark Brunell. We worked on his. He had like a beautiful beachfront home, and I mean, it was like a 15-bedroom home, like 30 cars, like just absolutely insane. It was the one time I was like, any chance we need to reshoot this, and I can go. I just want to see this beautiful, beautiful house. It was one where we got like some great aerial views and stuff like that, and that. I mean, you get to look inside their home, like it's a virtual tour of it, so you see all the pictures and stuff. So that was like the biggest, most like I mean, I would never want a home like that. It was just too much, but it was really cool to see basically a castle on the beach.
I mean, it's awesome if you have a big family. On a personal note, I think if you have like a really big house and it's, hopefully you're with someone, but especially if you're by yourself, I think it can be really depressing.
I have to imagine. And also, to me, I mean, we'll probably get into some responsibility stuff later. I don't like a lot of responsibility, and that sounds like a lot of unnecessary work.
Yeah, I would not want to live in a museum. So we'll see. We'll see where the future takes. Thinking a little bit after that, obviously the economy was recovering a little bit after kind of the dot-com burst, and there was, as we say, a party on Wall Street, as the world would say. But unfortunately, all parties come to an end. And not to get into some of the stuff that was going on within the financial industry, but broadly, the economy kind of crashed in 2008. So, how were you personally affected by that crash?
Oh man, it destroyed me. Absolutely destroyed me. And that was what I described as my rock bottom. So think about it. I had a business in real estate. And as soon as I turned 18, I started buying real estate as well. Buy and hold was my strategy. I was like, man, I've seen enough of this. I know the ropes. I can do this, and started doing that. And so I bought my first property in 2006. Fast forward a couple years, really as a 19, 20-year-old kid, I guess at that point, there was no way for me to have known. Like now, hindsight's 2020, right? Like all the signs were there, but like the reality is people just didn't know. And people were like, it's just going great, 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 great. And then it went to like instantly bad overnight. So my business went from doing really well, doing a lot of tours. I can't recall the exact number, but 30 plus tours of homes per day. I mean, we were just like knocking it out to one per week. I mean, think about the change that we went into, right? Like a huge drop. And so I had to let everybody go. The person who I initially got into it with, which was the person who had like the realtors and stuff like that, like that's who was like kind of running that side of things. He was bringing the business to us. I basically said, "Hey, this makes no sense for any of us." And so I didn't even sell the business. I just said, here's everything. Here's what we do. Here's how we do it. You can work with all these people and just take it and go with it. And I ended up moving into my first real like rental property because I couldn't afford anything else. So I was like, okay, I'm going to move into this now. And that was a really rock bottom moment for me because two things. One, it really just sucked. Everything I had worked for was just gone, tanked. But the other thing is, it was my first real failure, which is a really important part of any entrepreneur's journey. Like you're going to fail. Like that's you can't succeed without failing. Like if you're just keep on feeling like you're succeeding, you're probably not really going any right direction. Like you got to have some failures along the way because it's what builds the character. It's what helps you realign with your purpose. And if you think about it, golf balls did well, all my flipping stuff did well, that real estate thing did well, my first investment was doing good, to everything now aligned to me doing bad. And like I said, I identify that as my rock bottom moment. And it actually caused me to question the one thing I discovered that I thought I was good at, which was entrepreneurship. And it caused me to go into a corporate job because I felt like I want stability now. Like I'm turning into this person who's scared of risk, and I want to just go somewhere that's stable. And so, yeah, for me, rock bottom and on all levels at that point in my life. But something now I look back on, I'm extremely grateful for.
So speaking back, and I'll get into the grateful part for a second, but after you hit that rock bottom and it seems like it was a quick crash, how did you mentally put up with that? What was the day to day like?
Yeah, at first, it was definitely the things that you'd expect: depression, anxiety, all the feelings that you'd have. And the bad part was a lot of the friends I had accumulated at that point in my life were people that were more of a hustle mindset. They liked the money, right? And even the people I chose to date and stuff like that, same thing. They looked at the dollars, they looked at the nice car, right? Like really successful. And so for me, I was at all those things disappear, by the way, right? Like it shows you like who's your real friends are with you when you're doing really bad. And I didn't have anybody with me anymore. And it was one of those things where I was like, man, like I picked the wrong people to be around, but it's probably because I was the wrong person. I had become very arrogant, very prideful about my own skills, very like, I've done this. It's Alex, right? And the reality is that's just never the case for any of us. And so the way I described myself at that point was somebody who was defeated. And I had all the symptoms to go with feeling defeated, lack of confidence, just felt like I wasn't doing anything. And to make matters worse, the industry I got into was aerospace. I wasn't an astronaut, skydiver, or fighter pilot, so nothing
Not yet.
interesting.
Not
Not,
yet.
not yet, right? But what I got into is I just got a part-time job at a company that was very stable, not going to go anywhere, and I was breaking down boxes and taking out people's trash. It's all I could get. And so again, like talk about like a stab to like to my pride, right? But that's how I describe myself at that point. And it was just a tough, lonely time.
So as you were on, thankfully you've been able to get up, but thinking back to that initial, we'll just say kind of moving up that curve or kind of that life curve, was there any moment that led to the specific change or was it something that gradually happened over time?
There was a specific moment actually, which I don't think happens for everybody. But I remember one evening I came home from work and I was getting, we went to my mailbox and I saw a flyer that was actually for a young adults church ministry. And I grew up in church, but had really drifted away over through high school and stuff like that. And for some reason, I was just like, I'm gonna go check this out. And it took me like 3 weeks to get the courage. Like it just sat there on my counter for like 3 weeks before I finally was like, okay, I'm gonna go. You know what? Forget it. But I didn't go because I was like, everyone there's gonna judge me, like everyone else in my life. They're gonna see them a complete failure. And honestly, like I was raised better than I've been, so I also don't deserve to be somewhere like this, right? But something different happened. I walked in and I immediately felt welcomed by people, but I also felt like And I can't really describe this. I know this isn't like a spiritual podcast, but I felt like God met me where I was, and I really understood who Jesus was for the first time. And when that hit me, I felt like, wow, I actually, my self-worth isn't in my achievement. It's in something that I'm not even directly connected to. It's someone else's love for me because of who I am. And at that moment, that was literally like a light bulb went off and I had a full shift. I'm not going to say like overnight, everything got better, right? Like, but it was the moment that I can still look back to and tie to, saying that was the moment that the pendulum swung. And I started going back to who I knew I was supposed to be. And for the first time, not even go back, I shouldn't say, but become the person who I was supposed to be. So that for me was that shifting moment.
Thinking about religion for a second, not to get too into it, but there are a lot of religions out there, focusing on kind of a lot of the bigger ones. They all look up to God. What I wanted to ask is, do you think that without religion, you'd be in the same place that you are now?
I've never considered myself a religious person.
But a believing, like a faithful
Yeah,
person.
so for me, it's like a faith in the person of Jesus. Like
Mhm.
that's what it comes down to. So for me, like I don't necessarily like I don't even really identify as like a Christian, which I guess quote unquote is what it would be. But just like I knew the encounter I had with Jesus is the only way I could say it. And for me, I can say that no, I wouldn't be who I am. That's like that has become the complete foundation of my life and everything I've built. I follow all the principles I can learn from the person who Jesus was
Mhm.
and is. And so for me, like I really, it sounds weird because most people are like, how can you say that? But like I don't identify as a as a Christian or like as a religious person at all. Just someone who follows Jesus. Like at the very least, he's a great example. So
So point is, it's like even whatever your religion or whatever kind of level of faith that you have, if you have some kind of higher principle, and assuming that principle is based in good faith, that can ultimately really drive you forward to do well and add to the world.
it's been my experience, and I encourage people try Jesus. Is all I got. So
Got it.
that's my only plug today. By the way, Daniel, I don't want any other like any other plug. My product, Jesus.
Yeah, got it. Sounds good. So, for you, Jesus, for other religions, someone else, but definitely, we see where you're going with that. Getting back into your story a little bit, can you tell me a little bit about that first corporate role? I know you were working in aerospace. Like, what'd you learn? I know it was a humbling experience. Like, how did life change from going to an entrepreneur to working in that corporate role, and what'd you ultimately learn there?
So I started off with the wrong mindset because my mindset was like, I'm defeated. I'm here because I have to be, right? I felt like that person who just was going to just coast. But I had that like encounter, that moment where I realized, okay, there's something else for me. I started really applying myself. So part-time receiving clerk, taking up the trash, breaking down boxes, right? That's what I was doing. And I started thinking of the work I was doing differently. I was like, I'm going to excel in this business. And now there's actually a term that's been coined. It's called an entrepreneur, which just means an entrepreneur inside of an organization. So I don't know if that's like official, but like I've heard a lot of people say it. And that's really how I operated. I operated as an owner inside this business, even though I wasn't that. I was a part-time employee with the focus of doing my best to serve this company because that's where I felt like I was supposed to be at that point. So I did little things like, hey, this trash can's always full every day. Let's put a bigger trash can here. This one's always empty. Let's put a smaller trash can here. Hey, instead of breaking down boxes all over the place, this looks like a safety hazard. Let's make a central spot where we can wheel everything over to and we can all break it down there. Things like that get you very, very noticed in a company really fast. I very quickly climbed the ladder. And I say very quickly, I did a 15-year time at this same corporation and went from being a privately run company to a huge publicly traded company in the time that I was there. But I started from that part-time guy. And when I left, I was on the C-suite. I reported directly to the CEO. And it's a big company, Canadian owned actually. I worked out of Florida, but Canadian owned by the Canadians, and it was just a really great thing to be part of.
Gotta love that Canadian hospitality for sure.
You know it.
So thinking back on another note, I know reading through your story, kind of when you started going to church, you actually met your wife. So I'm just curious what that meeting was like.
Yeah. It was different for each of us, which I think is really common. I walked into the building. We were actually both serving at a campus of the church we are going to that wasn't where either of us normally went. We went to different places, but we were both like asked to help because they were just getting started. And so I walked in and she immediately, it was early. It was just volunteers and stuff like that. I walked in and she was the first person to greet me. When she walked up to me, like on her way walking up to me, I was like, I'm in love. Like, I have to know who this is. And that's just how I felt. Like legitimately, I was like, man, this is her, right? And that was not really felt the same way on the other side. Long story short, we were friends for many years before we even considered dating,
That's how the
which is
stories usually
actually
go.
a really good foundation to have, I think. So many years of just friendship before we like really got into it. But yeah, that's how we met and grew a great friendship.
Yep, that's how those stories usually start. So happy to see that it came into fruition. Speaking about when you were working for that church and kind of as you were servicing them, you actually started a blog where you were kind of writing about a lot of stuff that you were learning and stuff going on kind of in your life and within the church. How did you go from blogging to podcasting?
It seems like a natural thing now that I say it, but at that point, it wasn't. I started blogging because first I started texting. And what I mean by I started texting, so many people asked about like the journey I was on. Like, how did you do so well in corporate? Like, you did really bad in this. Like, people were learning my story. And so I just started sending out like little text messages encouraging people because I was like, oh man, this could be really helpful. And started going to hundreds of people. And when you start getting to that many people, some of them will start being like, can you elaborate on that? I really need this. What is this? And that led me to go find something called WordPress. I was like, I can write more thoughts here. So I just started blogging, even though I didn't even know what that meant. But I just started writing it. And I had never been a writer. Remember, like going back to me being a student, I wasn't great at it, but I was passionate to write about these topics I was covering. And all of it was just really how to excel in life. And I took it from the angle of like, hey, this is how Jesus has impacted my life. So I took it from a very relational approach, if you will, and how like that impacted me. And that really grew and took off. And at one point, the next natural progression from texting to writing was maybe talking if I wanted to elaborate even more. And so I just started a podcast along with it that actually ended up doing extremely well. And that was like the whole time, that was a side hustle. I never made a dime doing it, never wanted to. I was doing really well at my corporate job. Obviously, I was climbing the ladder at the same time as doing that, but that became one of my primary hobbies.
Thinking about podcasting, which fortunately we're, grateful enough and fortunate enough to be doing right as we speak. As you made that transition, why do you think you fell in love with the art of podcasting, the art of talking to other people, learning about them?
I think that at first, when I started, I didn't know what to expect. So I didn't go into it with that expectation. But the first time I interviewed somebody, it was somebody I knew, but I learned a bunch of new things about them and actually wanted to take notes myself. So I went back later and like took notes because I'm like, wow, there's a lot here. Like we only talked for 20 minutes and it was huge, right? And that's what I loved. I was like, whether I knew somebody or not, if you do a good job asking the right questions, they might even learn something along the way as well. And I was like, what a gift on both sides of the microphone, but also for anyone who gets the opportunity to hear this. And I think that's what I just loved is the value that was getting added, not just between the two of us, guest and host, but also again, the person who got to hear it later got to hear the true emotion behind it, which went so much further than just a blog post. And I'm not dogging it. I still this day love writing blogs and stuff like that. I think it's super cool. But when you can hear the emotion, when you can kind of see it, you can feel like you're there, part of it, it makes such a big impact.
So, on one of the things that you just said, you spoke about interviewing those first few guests. Who were those first few guests?
Man, Daniel, take me way back.
Cobweb time.
Yeah, the very first one was I'm probably getting this wrong. To my knowledge, the first one was somebody who I was in church small groups with for a long time, who was an athlete and really just like did so well in that space. And he got into like the like I don't know to call it child prodigy athletes, basically like teaching a pitcher to become like a 15-year-old kid to becoming like an MLB pitcher, right? Like he kind of became that guy. So he's like known for doing that. So I just interviewed him about like how did you go through that? It was super interesting because I didn't know most of his story, even though I thought I did. Another one was somebody who she got like disowned from her family completely, like just throughout her life, and like she like cried on that podcast. Like I was like, do you air this? Like, what do you do with that, right? But like, it was a great time for self discovery, even for her. Those were a couple of the first few that really like I feel like I got a lot out of, and I know we got a lot of people reaching in about it as well.
It's awesome to hear that. You actually made the jump. I know you're working your corporate time, you're doing this blogging thing, and you're doing podcasting. You actually ended up making that jump from working your corporate role, which you so dearly loved. I'm interested to hear what other people, in all honesty, would say about their corporate roles, but happy that you actually enjoyed yours. But when you decided to make that leap, how did you know to kind of jump all in to burn the boats to making the jump from corporate America to entrepreneurship, like in terms of assessing risk, making those leaps, and officially launching your thing?
Yeah, I love the transition, just a transitional phase of this. So at year 12, I think, of my corporate life, that's when the company went public. And I'll never forget it, Daniel. I had this meeting with my CEO that was not, it was one of those meetings that wasn't supposed to happen. Those are usually not good, right? But I just remember one of my divisions in the company, I was overseeing 5 divisions at that point, and one of them, we saved a full 10% on our profit margin. And we're not talking like a small company, like this is a multi-billion-dollar organization, like huge. And so I leave my office, and my CEO's office was right down the hall, and I was like, just so psyched. I was like walking. I felt like I walked in with a cigar and holding scotch in the other hand, right? Like that was what was going on in my head. The reality is I knocked on his door. I was like, excuse me, sir, And so I sit down, but like I was sitting down pretty confidently. I was like, did you see the numbers we did in this division? And his response was, yeah, I saw them. And I could hear the distress in his voice. So I leaned in. I was like, Paul, we like saved that 10%. Like it was nothing we lost. And he goes, no, I know. And we quietly just sat there for a minute. I just like raised my arms. I'm like, what? And he goes, man, we didn't tell the shareholders we're going to do that. Like there was room to sell stocks at higher prices. We could have done this. And he goes, man, they're just not happy. He goes, and that comes to me, not to you. He's like, don't worry about it. He's like, but just don't do that again without us talking about it first. I was like, okay. And I'll never forget it. That moment, I left his office, I shut the door, and I started walking back to mine. And for the first time ever, that very short walk felt like a very long walk in that building. And I knew from the time I went there to getting back to my desk to looking out the window, and I just remember thinking, you know what, it's time for me to go. And I want to mention that my performance did not start to diminish. As a matter of fact, my last year there was my best year I ever had. Like from a performance standpoint, I crushed it every year, but my last year is by far my best because I believe the way you end one season is the way you begin the next. But I started trying a bunch of little side hustles, learning what I like. Like, do I want to do something in blogging? Oh, how about podcasting? Right. And I actually said both those things are going to be no. I thought web design looked cool. And I also thought like that maybe helping my wife do like a clothing store look cool. Like there was all these different things I thought would be very interesting. But the nice thing is I had a stable job I didn't hate. I just knew it was time for me to leave. And so I had the flexibility to try a bunch of different things. And ultimately, what I got into was starting PodMatch. And that's what kind of made that transition or that leap, if you will.
So speaking about PodMatch, we'll call this your first taste of latter entrepreneurial success. What was that first taste of entrepreneurial success like with PodMatch?
Yeah, it was the thing that stuck, right? And at that point, I was really in on podcasting. So I had started a second show. I called it Creating a Brand because while I was doing these side hustles, I was like, well, I want to learn from successful entrepreneurs how to leave a 9-to-5 job. So the idea was the art of creating a brand. Like, how do you actually leave this 9-to-5 job to become a full-time entrepreneur? So I was learning along the way. And what I found is I became very passionate about it. The first thing is I learned, and I want to share this because I think it'd be very valuable for people listening. I learned what entrepreneurship is and how to make this happen in 4 steps. And I'm way oversimplifying it, but I think it's very valuable for people to hear. The 4 steps to leaving your full-time job to become an entrepreneur are as follows. Number 1, find an area of passion and get into it. Find an area of passion, get into it. Now, you might have a bunch of passions, try them. You might get into it and realize you don't like it. But when you find something, you're like, I think this is something. Dive into it more by doing step 2, which is getting into the community. So get involved in it. Start volunteering, start helping. What does it look like? For me, it was podcasting. That was the area of passion I wanted to explore. So I started speaking at all the events, going to all the conferences. I got into the community. The third thing you want to do is when you start establishing yourself in that is to find a problem that community is struggling with. What is the thing that you're like, there's not an answer for this? And the only way to find it is not to sit back and whiteboard it out. It's to talk to the people involved, talk to the community. And for me, I'll never forget it. There was about 2,000 people at this podcasting conference. And when I got off stage, I just asked everyone who would talk to me. And it was about 100 and some odd people. And I was just writing down what they said. And 100 people told me, I'm having trouble finding the right guests for my show. I'm having trouble connecting with them. There was all these things around that idea. And so I knew that PodMatch was my idea, right? I didn't quite know what it was yet. But the fourth thing is to actually offer the solution to that problem. And I always say, find the simplest problem you can and offer the solution to that as fast as you possibly can. Simple problem, fast solution, because it allows you to test things. And it's very rare that we get it right the first time. And PodMatch had some things along the way when it got started, right? From alpha to beta to being a full product. We had to tweak a lot of things to get it to really work right. And that's why you want to do it as fast as you can and keep it as simple as you possibly can. And that whole thing, that's the process that I took from basically being that full-time corporate guy to ultimately leaving the job. And of course, there's some risk involved in that. There's like when to know to make the leap. There's all those things in between that. But that's ultimately like how the whole journey went in my head.
I appreciate the framework of you sharing that. I think it's always great when you can simplify something and have it applicable. I think a lot of times people try to simplify something and people don't resonate with it as much. So I really appreciate you sharing that bunch. When you're thinking about building the website, so on a bit of a more technical note here, by the way, the platform's incredible, beautifully set up. Everything's really easy to navigate. I mean, I'm a PodMatch member, so selfishly had to plug that in there. But when you're first making that alpha and beta versions, what challenges did you have, especially working with software?
Yeah, and real quick, for anyone who's like, okay, I don't know what PodMatch is. PodMatch is a service that connects podcast guests and hosts together for interviews. We always say it works a lot like a dating app, but instead of connecting you for dates, it connects you for podcast interviews. So you can have the conversation like this. Daniel and I actually connected through PodMatch. I'm the guest, he's the host. It was a match. We're here making it happen. So, and if you do want to check out PodMatch more, Daniel, I'm going to throw your link out there. Join podmatch.com/businesses Blumin is where you want to go. Check that out. And I know you have a link to it, but that's the only plug I want to do. So if you do just want to see what it looks like, you can see it on the homepage and take a look at it. But
Appreciate
the first thing, yeah, no problem, man. Always like to plug that affiliate link. You've been a great friend to us, so I'm super thankful for you.
Thank you.
The thing that I learned right away is I like to overcomplicate things. And I think it's actually my corporate background. Like when you get to be a $1 billion company with tons of moving pieces, tolerances that really matter because it's going on an airplane that people are going to be on, right? And it can fall out of the sky. You get into this thing of not perfection, but very, very close to it. And so for me, when I was thinking about anything with my business partner, who's the developer, I'm more like the vision, sales, marketing, that guy. I kept on making things way more complex than they need to be. And I know I shared, like, find the simple problem off their simple solution as fast as you can. But I kept on saying, okay, how are we going to match people? Like, what does that need to look like? Like, what does the UX and UI need to be? And I had to keep on going back to this thing that I learned from a friend of mine. He just calls it starting ugly, which means, man, if everything's spelt right and it doesn't take an hour to load, you're probably doing it wrong when you start. And that's really what I had to learn. My first struggle was letting go of perfection, letting go of my own pride in it, right? We're all work in progress. I mentioned pride being part of my life early on. So when we launched, it didn't look the way I wanted it to. We didn't have a logo. I had typos everywhere. But I went back to that 100 people that I got their contact information, the ones that said they wanted it. And I said, does it work? Hey, your logo is ugly. I said, not what I asked you. Does it work? Hey, you spelled this wrong. Not what I asked you. Does it work? And I kept on hearing the core function works, but I'm very confused on how to get there. And so what I learned is just let go of the complex stuff, let go of the perfection, and just work your way to it. So what I call it now is focusing on continuous improvement. And so for me, I'd say the first struggle I had to overcome was allowing that to be the case and allowing the journey to happen and trusting the fact that people wanted to see me succeed as well.
I think the one other thing that I'd add there too that I don't think people touch upon these days, especially with a lot of the stuff that you see on LinkedIn, and I think unfortunately, we live in a society where we glorify results. And as I said earlier, while results are important, I think people need to glorify the process because that's ultimately where more of the beauty and a lot of the stuff happens. A lot of times people want to go from step 1 to step 10 by like flicking their hand. Realistically, you have to go to step 2, step 3, step 4. So I just emphasize for every entrepreneur out there, like it takes a long time to build something up and you just have to kind of ingrain that in your head. I think it just saddens me sometimes to see that some people think stuff happens overnight. Just my 2 cents there.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think on episode 81 of your show, Stacey Gray did a really good job explaining what that entrepreneurial life and journey looks like. I encourage you, if you just heard what Daniel said and that spoke to you, go back and listen to episode 81 with Stacey Gray. Yeah. You did a great job interviewing her and she's absolutely brilliant, but I think it'll reinforce what you just said a lot.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Stacey was a cool guest. Speaking about podcasting, obviously you have a really successful a few really successful podcasts, but a lot of podcasts are starting up these days and it's a really booming area. And a lot of them are seeking to grow. So obviously people look at like the Lex Friedmans, the Joe Rogans, maybe the Danny Mirandas of the world that have been successful in growing their podcast. From someone that has a successful podcast and is quite literally in the business of podcasting, what's your number one piece of advice for growing a successful podcast?
Same thing we were just talking about with business, but to grow a successful podcast, you need to treat it like a business. So first and foremost, treat it like a business. Even if it's a hobby, yes, let it be a hobby, but build some structure around it. You don't necessarily need like goals to get it to grow big, but you need to make sure that that hobby doesn't become something that you hate or that you just don't want to open up and start doing because it's so much work. You want to build a system around it. But once you've really kind of figured that out, what really matters is who are you serving? Who are you podcasting for? And for many of us, we're like, well, I want to be a full-time content creator. So it's for me. I want financial freedom for my family. Those are great things, but that's not who it's for. That's just about you. You could do anything and do that. But if you're podcasting, there should be a very deep purpose that's connected to an ideal listener or an avatar, as we call it in the business, the person that it's truly going to serve and add value to. And the more connected you can get with who that person is and the problem that you're helping them solve, the better your show is going to end up getting. I find the people with the best podcasts aren't necessarily the biggest. They're the ones that are speaking to a really powerful niche audience in a way that no one else is speaking to them. I've seen some shows I consider to be wildly successful that have less than a few hundred listeners to them, but they're the only show talking about that. And everybody who's into that in the world listens to that show. And because of that, I find that to be just beyond successful. And many of them have gone on to create very passive income full-time businesses, right? So they work when they want to type of thing. And they really are just, it's all built around the podcast because they're the ones bringing that entire community, that niche together. And to me, that really is a success in podcasting, is helping that person transform from where they are to where they want to go and making a community aspect to go with it.
So, high level, do you think that one of the most important aspects is just consistently being able to deliver value to that listener avatar and really that community?
Yeah. I mean, you've got it. It's always got to be value. And it's got to be two things, value and entertainment. I heard somebody recently call it valuetainment. And here's the thing, you can have
David,
value all day. And
PBD is about to come after you now.
is that who said it? Oops.
I think no. So he has a company called Value Entertainment or Valuetainment. So that's what.
Oh,
That's
nice.
the name,
Okay.
yeah.
Good,
So it's
good to
okay.
know.
Maybe he'll listen to this podcast. We could do like a three-way show one time. So
Maybe where he's like, yo, dude, you owe me money for saying my company. So we'll
yeah,
see.
I think he's worth north of nine figures. I don't think he'll he'll
Yeah.
be too worried, but we'll see.
So my problem that I learned early on podcasting is I like to add a lot of value in very actionable ways. Anyone who's heard me so far in this can tell, like I've given steps, points, and I used to not interject stories. I used to be like, step 1 is this, step 2 is this. I've learned to interject stories and try to add a little humor where I can. I'm working on that part. But the thing is, you have to add some stories because it has to be entertaining. If it's just straight information and data, you're not going to hold people's attention very long because it's hard to learn that way. It's got to have a level of entertainment to make it feel fun to listen to. Some of my favorite podcasts are the ones that I'm like, man, I'm taking notes. This is so good. Halfway through a note, you start laughing because they said something hilarious. That keeps your brain saying, okay, let's keep on learning. This is a good time. Like we're learning and we're having a good time together. And I find that the best podcasters are the ones that find that happy medium. Again, coming from the total left field of that, strictly value, it's tough, right? And if it's just all pure entertainment, people might not listen forever because they feel like, oh man, this kind of makes me feel like I'm not like, it's just kind of guilty pleasure. It's just like another TV show, but I'm just listening to this one, right? People want to also have something in it that helps them feel like they're getting smarter, furthering who they are. And that's why a lot of great comedians these days, they throw some really, some big knowledge. Like you can be laughing hysterically and you're like, dang, I didn't know that. Like that's a really interesting concept. They've learned to be able to throw that in there as well because they're like, I'm adding value while I'm being entertaining as well.
So it's like a mix of a college professor and all the comedians from the roast of Tom Brady would be a perfect.
That's it. You found them.
Yeah, I won't get too into the conversations there because there were some hot topics which people have multiple interpretations to. I'll leave it at that. That's really, really cool and really interesting to hear. A lot about when it comes to growing a podcast is having, as you said, delivering a lot of value to the show and really being able to speak to your audience. But the other thing that I wanted to emphasize, like you just said, I think a lot of corporate America, what they don't do right is they try to keep it to that very like step 1, step 2, step 3 sort of organization. Where I think, and this is hard because it's more of an artistic aspect, I think that what would help corporate America a lot is if they incorporated some fun into it, if they made something a little more funny, a little more humorous. Because I think if something is either too artful or too sciencey, it doesn't work out. So if you can find some kind of optimal combination of the two, I think that would ultimately make, training employees easier, make employees happier, and ultimately boost performance over time.
100%, man. A great example of that is this. Let's go previous year's Super Bowl. I think it was the 2024 Super Bowl. And, there was I don't even remember who the commercial was. I want to say it was Amazon who did it, but they showed these ladies that were watching kids go down like a slope, like on I don't know, whatever they're going on, and then it showed one of them going to Amazon and ordering something that's more padded, so that they're at their age they wouldn't get hurt sliding down the snow, and they're sliding down, and then it makes all of them, like they're older, they're all laughing, and then they go into like a memory where each of them are young kids doing that together. And I was like, man, Amazon could have just said, we ship your stuff really fast, get what you want, and then enjoy it. And if you don't like it, return it. Thank you very much. We're done. But instead, they had this thing that emotionally like brought you into like, man, isn't that just life? Like, what a fun thing. Like, so cool to see the retrospect of these people's entire lives, right? And at the end, it's just like Amazon Prime. And it made you remember, like, yeah, that is something I really like. You felt like you're in the moment. I think they did a beautiful job with that commercial. And so many other ones, I felt like, man, this was really like one-dimensional, just straight to the facts. And again, being a facts guy, it even bothered me seeing some of those things. So yeah, I think I don't mean to just reinforce the point you said, but I think that's a beautiful thing for any entrepreneur to make sure that they do. The best practical way I found to do that is just engrave your personality into it. Share the journey, not just the wins. Share the losses, share the mistakes. Let it feel like real life, and people are going on that journey with you. The better you get at doing that, the more it feels human. And I've learned this about people. They like to work with humans more than anything else.
Yeah, I mean AI is great, but I do think that there isn't a replacement for people with personality. And the one thing that I would add to that is that I'm trying to think of the right way to phrase it. It's almost as if like humans have an innate need to connect with one another, and it's almost like a programming. It's not, obviously people have different talents and whatnot, but it's almost like a programming that people have to want to connect with each other. And almost the only way to take advantage of that innate programming, if I'm making like a sciencey thing sound artsy, if that makes sense, is to try to relate to people, try to invoke an emotion in them. And oftentimes when you're trying to work with people, if you can invoke a positive emotion in someone, their performance is probably going to get better. So I think that's just something that people don't do enough of these days.
Yeah, I completely agree with you.
So, thinking into the future, you're the founder of a glorious company, PodMatch, that we spoke about earlier. You have a lot of, really great people on the platform, but you also have a lot of really great products, including Pod Lottery and, a few others. Overall, what's your vision for the future of PodMatch?
For everything to only be on PodMatch. So when I left corporate, what I got really good at was simplifying. I mentioned this earlier, but like removing responsibility. We're talking about like that big house. Like I wouldn't want that responsibility. I've done my best to remove as much responsibility as I can, because the less responsibility I have, the more responsible I can be with the things that matter most. A great example of this is when I decided to leave corporate, I decided to like do a full Excel spreadsheet, figuring out what the expenses we need to be. My wife and I dropped to one car. We live in a condo that we were able to pay off. Like we were smart financially, so we had no debt at all, because we knew that, hey, if we're not going to get paid for 2 years, which is probably the life cycle what this will be before that happens, we're going from really high salary to no salary. How far can we make with our savings, and what do we need to get rid of to minimize that number as much as we can? And I share that background, that story, because I still do that in business today, and I'm not always good at it. Again, I overcomplicate things. The way I overcomplicated PodMatch is I created 6 other companies that go around it. Each is done well, but each has its own responsibility that goes with it. And the next phase of what we're doing is we're bringing everything we do into PodMatch, including Pod Lottery, which is a way that podcast hosts get reviewed for their shows, doing like fancy, fun lottery-based swaps, if you will. We're bringing that into PodMatch. We've already brought a previous product into it. We've brought our virtual event into it, our blog we've brought into it. So everything, we're bringing it all together because we're trying to minimize the amount of responsibility we have, because it's all going to be just in the one main focus. The best way I can show this is actually a movie that I really enjoyed. Daniel, you into sci-fi movies? Do you like sci-fi or no?
Semi. Depends what movie.
Okay. All right. I'm a sci-fi nerd. I don't know why. I always have been. But there's a movie called Ender's Game. And in Ender's Game, at the end of it, Endor and his team, and they're defending Earth versus this alien race. It's the enemy. I'm not trying to give away the whole movie. Sorry, everybody. Spoiler. It came out a long time ago, so it's your fault. But basically, at the end, he's realizing that his strategy is not going to work. And he's this kid who's like a mastermind, and he's like looking at his whole army. He's controlling it all from like a central database, and he's got all of his team with him. And he realizes, we've got so many things going on. We're trying to defeat this enemy. It's not going to work. So he changes his entire strategy. He goes, everybody stop and protect Petra. And Petra was this one ship with a gun that could actually destroy an entire planet. And he knew that was their only hope. So what he did is he said, everything else is going to get destroyed. Stop defending everything. All the fighters move and just protect Petra. And the reason I share that is because like they ended up winning, spoiler, right? But they ended up winning because they were willing to say, none of these things matter as much as this one thing that is going to be what gets us to where we want to go. Stop defending those things. Let them die. Let them go. And they had to make that huge sacrifice in order to say, this is the only way we can win. And I think that in business, we have to be willing to do that as well, because there's always going to be this draw saying, do more, do more. I fell into that trap because we were doing well, and everything I kept on touching kept on doing well. And so we look at companies like Meta, which owns Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, tons of others, right?
Media out there,
Correct.
Pretty much.
Yeah, Alphabet, who owns Google and all these other like 1,000 other tools as well, right? And I was like, we can build that same thing. But the reality is, that's not a fun business for an entrepreneur. And it becomes very lifeless very fast. And if you do that too early, it could cripple you. And I felt like I was getting more toward that crippling point. So instead, we said, get rid of all this stuff, let it die, bring it in-house if we can. We're going to do our best with it, but we're going to focus on PodMatch, which I consider our Petra, right? We're doing our best to do that because that's ultimately what is serving podcast guests and hosts more than anything else we do. And we'll just slowly bring everything into it as we can. And so for me, I think that's probably the biggest lesson I can give as an entrepreneur. Fight the overcomplication, fight the additional responsibilities, and keep everything at the core of what you know that you do that truly serves people.
Alex, I want to ask you one last quick question here. You've had an interesting entrepreneurial journey, to say the least. At the end of it all, when people are kind of thinking back about you and you're thinking back on your life, what do you want your legacy to be?
I want to be remembered as somebody who really had empathy and loved people. I believe empathy is really a lost art these days. As we get more disconnected while being more connected through things like the internet, I feel like we lose the fact that there's a human being on the other side of what we're doing that might be hurting, that might be suffering, that might be celebrating. And the more we can put ourselves in their shoes and understand that, hey, we want to be part of the struggle with you, we want to be part of the joy with you, the more we can create that human connection, even online and offline is extremely important as well. But the more we can do that, the better we can do to be. And so I remember as someone who truly loved like Jesus and was empathetic toward the needs of other people and did his best to meet him where he could in his lane. And right now, that lane happens to be podcasting. I can't tell you what it's going to be in the future, but right now, that's where it is. But the one thing I'm always going to carry with me is the singular focus of where I can best serve, to be empathetic, to serve someone else's journey. I'm going to do that every chance I get.
I love that, and we'll be with you on that journey. But Alex, thanks so much for taking the time, and it's been an absolute blast.
Thanks, Daniel. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to my conversation with Alex Sanfilippo. If you took away any value from the episode at all, please subscribe to the show. I'm on a mission to build the world's #1 entrepreneurship podcast, and I can't get there without you. Thanks for all your support, and I'll see you next time.